I'm honored to be here. In a conference of ideas, I want to stop to take a moment to talk about a man, Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States. As you know, he came from New England, Plymouth Notch, Vermont, a place so remote that the railroad chose not to go there. The Coolidges were Republicans. Coolidge attended Amherst College, read law at a small-town firm, rose in politics in the state of Massachusetts, going from representative in the town of Northampton all the way to governor of the Bay State and then on to national politics. He arrived in Washington as vice president to Warren Harding in 1921, and when Harding passed away in the summer of 23, Coolidge became president. He was elected on his own, and by the way, with an absolute majority in 1924, and served that term, returning to his plowshares or plow in 1929 back in Northampton. With a few exceptions, I think Charles Kessler is here. I would mention Claremont. Most universities and publishers don't pay much attention to Coolidge. He's kind of a placeholder between Roosevelt's or maybe Wilson in the history books that our children read. Amherst honors a part-time instructor at the college, that would be Robert Frost, far more than it honors its president, alumnus, Calvin Coolidge. As you also know, Coolidge is sometimes portrayed as a quirky country bumpkin. He's been much derided. Sometimes he's referred to, or a phrase is repeated, that he was the accident of an accident. Experts rate him as a failure, though not this room, or weak. Nowadays, we tend to psychologize people whom we want to downgrade. Naturally, Coolidge has been thrust upon the psychiatric couch. Coolidge had Asperger's. He was quaintly terse. Little anecdotes about him. As it happened, the president's son did die while he was president. That was Calvin Jr., and there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that the death of his son incapacitated Coolidge, causing him to do little in his last years in the presidency, and to choose not to run again when he might. I think among conservatives, there's also some much reservation about Coolidge because he is unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "Get action." Coolidge was the maestro of inaction. I come to you to revise the stereotype, to help you to revise it. I'll provide a little sketch of Coolidge, the man. I'll offer some evidence that acquits him, or may acquit him, of those damning charges of failure and weakness, and I'll offer a word or two on Coolidge's motives and ask you to decide yourself whether he warrants the attention of conservatives today. Let's start with the major charges, failure and weakness. I think we can agree that the strength of a politician can be measured by something simple, which is whether the politician, once elected, manages to actually achieve what he promised to achieve during his campaign. Coolidge campaigned almost his entire life. He was a professional politician and served in more offices than any president since. Across the state of Massachusetts, he was known as a, open quote, regular Republican, close quote, a reliable friend to party. He was also known, by the way, as the politician of immigrants. He was supported by German Americans, Irish Americans, Polish Americans in Massachusetts, then a more industrial state, and getting immigrants was a talent then prized as now by the Grand Old Party. For the purposes of this discussion, we can look at starting at Coolidge's campaigns for governor around World War I's end and for national office in the 20s. This was, as you recall, the period of the Great Progressive Movement. The revolutionary unrest of continental Europe moved America just as it moved Burke's Britain. Stopping the progressive wave seemed almost impossible. Nonetheless, in his campaigns, Coolidge made essentially one promise: damage control. He would check the progressive flood for as long as he could. He would preserve the rule or reign of law. He used the verb reign. He would preserve state government and state and local institutions. He would preserve community. He would preserve commerce, the individual, and religious authority. Again, given the strength of the flood of the progressivism, this was a tall order. So imagine Coolidge as a sort of figure attempting to put, say, a finger in the dike, or shore up ground, or build a flood wall. It was typical of Coolidge that he regarded such efforts, sometimes obviously only palliative, sometimes hopefully preventative, as worthy, important for the record, even if he or the party might fail in the moment. The year 1919 brought Coolidge's first great test. As a gubernatorial candidate, he had promised to cut back the progressive government of Massachusetts, Massachusetts being at the time one of the premier examples of progressivism. In America, we had, of course, state progressivism before we had Washington progressivism. And cutting back entailed firing a lot of friends, closing down a lot of departments where he had operated. He had to draw up the list and lay off the friends, and he found this very difficult. He said it was the most difficult thing he did as governor of Massachusetts, yet he did it. That's the first one. Very tough. Hundreds of people, hundreds of small offices. The second test also came during his gubernatorial period in his campaign in 1919 for re-election. It involved the threat to institutions by progressivism. I mentioned Europe's revolutionary turmoil before. In Boston, which is a port city, after all, this was felt very keenly. The police force was almost entirely Irish-American and watched closely the revolutionary movement in Ireland. Eamon de Valera actually spoke at Fenway Park, for example, so it was close and far. Many Irish-Americans had been over to Europe as soldiers quite recently. The Boston police, in this instance, had signed contracts that said they may not strike. But they were inspired, and they were mostly Irish-American, and strike they did against their contracts. The policemen said to strike was their right, their God-given right. And they laid down their leather helmets and walked off the job. Looting and rampage ensued. Boston had its own Gordon riots, and by a quirk of the law, Coolidge, as state governor, was responsible for law enforcement. He faced a choice: conciliate with the policemen, his own constituents, in an election year, or enforce the law. Coolidge enforced the law. In the end, he fired the policeman. And when he did, he spoke generally, categorically, not specifically. He did not say these policemen were wrong this time. He said there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, any time. The riots stopped, peace returned. Coolidge, in fact, did win re-election. More importantly, he set a precedent of rejection of public sector union labor action, strikes per se, that was noticed throughout the nation. And on this side of the Atlantic, the strikes of this nature abated. One later president who noticed this was Ronald Reagan, who faced his own public sector strike of the air traffic controllers, their union, PATCO, and who thought of Reagan when he took his own bold move to fire the PATCO officers. Very tough decision. What about national promises? In the 1920 campaign, Harding and Coolidge promised explicitly a return to normalcy. That is, again, to do what they could to halt the progressive onslaught. As President Coolidge again struggled, there was this subtle attack of regulation, which I think Chris DeMuth spoke about this morning. Regulation wasn't like a tsunami. It was more like wisteria attacking, I don't know, a rhododendron or a magnolia bush. That is to say, it crept and crawled everywhere. And Coolidge understood the pernicious effect of it. He didn't like the volume. He didn't like too many laws. He said, give administration a chance to catch up with legislation. And he advised his father, who was also a lawmaker, it is better to kill a bad law than to pass a good one. It is important to understand the intensity of the barrage of laws on a president in that period. Coolidge did not have all the support he wanted in Congress, so there was the additional challenge of knowing that one's vetoes, if one vetoed, could be overridden. Nonetheless, in this period, in the 20s, in this man, Coolidge saw value in a veto, even a veto that would be overridden. He vetoed 50 times, putting great effort into his veto messages for now, for the moment, and for posterity. He vetoed Social Security's forerunners, pension laws for veterans. He vetoed agricultural subsidy. He vetoed emergency rescue for natural disasters, the Katrinas of his era. He vetoed fishing subsidy. The list goes on. A veto sounds easy, but it is not for telling people no. It takes great strength. There is a device, we talked a lot about temperament today, there is a device called a pocket veto, which is essentially a veto by presidential inaction. Coolidge's temperament was not to move, and naturally he loved the pocket veto. It takes some skill to work a pocket veto. You have to kind of trick the legislature into passing a law very close to recess and then not do anything with it. Coolidge worked hard on that, and he became a regular maestro, an Isaac Stern of the pocket veto. And he enjoyed that particularly because a pocket veto requires no message and cannot be overridden. Humor was not Coolidge's weakness, it was his weapon. One of the tricks of lobbyists is always to seek to win acquiescence of executives by playing to the particular interest of the executive. Coolidge came from an agricultural state. Those of you who know Vermont know that farming is very tough there. The topsoil is dauntingly shallow. Underneath is all geology, is all rock. This is the gift of the glaciers. It is said that all you can farm in Vermont is rocks. Coolidge's own family had struggled with farming for many generations, so the lobbyists thought Coolidge would be susceptible to the idea of agricultural subsidy. Wrong. He blocked such legislation, as I mentioned often. There is a story told of Coolidge's interview with two lobbyists, and listen for the music of his non-phrase as I repeat what happened. The pair make their case to the president. We need agricultural subsidy, you know that, and then waited for Silent Cal's response. Took a while in coming. I'm going to pretend I'm Calvin Coolidge now. Pause, pause, pause. Well, farmers never have made much money. Pause. Don't suppose they ever will. Pause. Don't suppose there's much the government can do about it. Coolidge and the Republicans promised tax cuts in their campaigns. Following the lead of his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, principal of delegation, they did cut taxes 3 times, in fact. And I'll speak a bit about that later. I'm conscious of the time. Coolidge loved immigrants. He viewed them not paternalistically, but fraternally. He said, no matter by what various crafts we came here, we are all now in the same boat. Whether we came on the Mayflower or in the steerage. But he also believed that what he called, and we call, Americanism was precious, and he signed a restrictive immigration law for that reason, the Johnson-Reed Act. He emphasized that immigrants were only welcome if they naturalized. Uncomfortable language for today. In fact, the complete Coolidge quote about immigrants is, whether one traces his Americanism back 3 centuries to the Mayflower or 3 years of the steerage, is not half so important as whether his Americanism of today is real and genuine. No matter by what various craft we came here, we are in the same boat. Coolidge did not run again in 1928, generally a move attributed to weakness, but he achieved what he said he would do. He dropped the tax rate. He actually cut the government. Today, when we speak of government and cutting it, we mean reduction of the increase in government. He actually cut it after 67 months. If you go back to look at national accounts, you'll see the number was lower in real and nominal terms than when he started. This is an astounding thing for a president to do in a prosperous era. We can look at Coolidge's how. I think you've got a feel of it, but I just want to say a last couple words about why he did what he did. His motivations were unusual. Tax is an example. He respected Mellon and Mellon's utilitarian formulae, which are basically forerunners of supply-side economics. But Coolidge also believed in tax cuts because he thought heavy taxation immoral. That was his own motivation. He said, don't expect to help the weak by pulling down the strong. So whatever the data showed about revenue flows, and the data did show good things, this was the principle of Coolidge taxation, a far stronger one than mere arithmetic. He also believed that you do not restrain government because it is satisfying in some sort of emotional yelling at the television way to revenge yourself upon government. You restrain, he even believed government was good or could be good. You restrained government for other reasons in order to create space for things that are elsewise important in life. That is, you restrain government because of your obligation to federalism, to your own state, to community, to church, for things of the spirit, as he called them. A final motivation for Coolidge was his anxiety at the fragility of our form of government. The president saw America was easy to lose, very easy to lose, and he took great pains to preserve it, to restore it, to remove any taint, for example, of the Harding scandal. Part of that is the humility of the chief executive. Once, when the president was in one of his funks, Senator Selden Spencer took Coolidge along Pennsylvania Avenue for a walk, and to cheer Coolidge up, the senator said, "Look over there at that white building with the pretty pillars. What lucky gent lives in that building? Who lives there?" And Coolidge said, darkly but truly, "Nobody lives there. They just come and go." You can see now that his decision not to run again in 28 was not weakness or personal grief, but rather a strength of returning, of ceding, as he said, the office after a moderate length of time. I will say one final thing. It is often said among conservatives that Coolidge failed because his blocking action worked only temporarily. The flood of progressivism indeed subsequently poured over the country with the New Deal in the 1930s. So it was. But in fact, like Burke, Coolidge believed that even a failed effort has value. For the record, one establishes, inspires leadership in another time. The very same endeavors that Coolidge failed in can inspire us now, and hopefully also at this important conference.